I still remember the smell of smoke before I remember the screams. It was thick and bitter, the kind of smoke that doesn't just burn your lungs, it settles into your bones. Even now, years later, whenever I smell burning wood, my mind drifts back to that night in the Arizona Territory when my life was split into two pieces, the life before the fire and the life after. Back then I was just a boy of 14. Our ranch sat alone at the edge of a long valley where the desert met the mountains. It wasn't much, just a small wooden cabin, a horse corral, and a few dusty acres my father tried his best to tame. But to me, it was the whole world. My father was a quiet man, named Thomas Hale. He believed in hard work, few words, and honest living. His hands were always rough from ranch work, and his face had deep lines from years under the desert sun. My mother, Sarah, was the opposite. She had a warm laugh that could fill the entire valley. Even when times were hard, and they often were, she found a way to smile. Life on the frontier was never easy. Water was scarce. Winters were cruel, and the land itself sometimes felt like it wanted us gone. But we stayed because my father believed something important. Land doesn't belong to the strongest man, he once told me, while repairing a fence. It belongs to the man stubborn enough to stay. I believed him. Every morning I woke before sunrise. I helped feed the horses, mend fences, and haul water from the creek nearly a mile away. My hands were already rough for my age, but I didn't mind. That was just life. At night, we sat around a small fire inside the cabin. My mother cooked beans and cornbread while my father cleaned his rifle. Sometimes coyotes howled in the distance. Sometimes the wind howled louder. But most nights were peaceful. Until the night everything ended. It started with the horses. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to the sound of frantic neighing. Horses don't panic without reason. I had learned that much growing up around them. At first I thought it was coyotes. Then I heard something worse. Gunshots. The sound cracked through the quiet valley like thunder. My father was already out of bed. He grabbed his rifle and rushed toward the door. The lantern light revealed something I had never seen before. Fear on his face. "Stay inside," he said sharply. But curiosity and fear are stronger than obedience when you're 14. I crept behind him and peeked through the doorway. Riders. 5 of them. They came out of the darkness like ghosts on horseback. Their hats were low, their faces hidden by shadows. One of them carried a burning torch. Outlaws. Even before the next gunshot, I knew. My father fired first. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, and one of the riders fell from his horse with a cry. For a moment, I felt hope. But then the others charged. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls. Wood splintered. The horses screamed and kicked against their corral. My mother grabbed my arm and tried to pull me back. "Daniel, inside!" But it was too late. A torch sailed through the open window. The cabin erupted into flames like dry grass. The fire spread instantly, devouring everything it touched. Heat rushed across the room like a living creature. My father fired again. Another rider fell. But the remaining men circled the cabin like wolves. I remember chaos, shouting, gunshots, the crack of burning wood. My father turned to us one last time. "Run," he shouted. Those were the last words I ever heard him speak. My mother pulled me outside through the back door. The night air felt freezing compared to the flames behind us. We ran toward the creek, but the outlaws had already surrounded the ranch. A rider appeared in front of us. My mother pushed me behind her. The man raised his gun. The shot echoed across the valley. I remember falling. I remember hitting the ground hard. Everything went dark. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. At first I didn't remember where I was. Then I smelled the smoke. The ranch was gone. The cabin was nothing but blackened ruins. The corral had collapsed. The horses had either escaped or died. I couldn't tell which. My head pounded as I tried to stand. "Ma," I called weakly. No answer. I stumbled across the dirt, toward the burned remains of the cabin. Pa, still nothing. The silence was worse than the gunshots had been. I searched the ruins for hours. I don't remember crying at first. I think my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. But eventually the truth broke through. They were gone, both of them. My family, my home, everything I had ever known. The desert suddenly felt enormous and empty. I sat in the dirt beside the ashes of our cabin and stared at the mountains in the distance. I didn't know what to do. I had no horse, no food, no water, and no one left in the world. The sun climbed higher until the heat became unbearable. That's when I heard something behind me. Hoofbeats, slow, quiet, controlled. My heart jumped into my throat. I turned around slowly. 5 riders stood on a ridge above the destroyed ranch. Apache warriors. Every story I had heard growing up told me to fear them. Settlers spoke about Apache raiders the same way they spoke about storms, unpredictable and deadly. For a moment I thought they had come to finish what the outlaws started. The warriors studied me silently. Their horses stood perfectly still. The oldest rider finally dismounted. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man who had seen too much war in his life. His hair was streaked with gray. Deep lines marked his face like the desert itself had carved them there. He walked down the slope toward me. I tried to stand, but my legs shook too badly. He stopped a few feet away and looked around the burned ranch. Then he looked at me. His eyes were sharp, but not cruel. "You alone?" he asked in broken English. My voice barely worked. "Yes." He looked toward the ruins again. Then he nodded slowly, as if understanding everything, without needing more words. Another warrior sent something to him in Apache. The old man responded calmly. Finally he turned back to me. "You come," he said. I didn't move. Fear rooted me to the ground. He studied me for a moment longer, before speaking again. "No family," he said, pointing to the ashes. "No home." Then he gestured toward the mountains. Apache camp there. I didn't understand why he was offering. I was the son of settlers, the kind of people who had taken land from tribes like his. But he didn't seem to care. He extended his hand. "Come." That moment changed everything. If I had stayed at that burned ranch, I would have died. The desert doesn't forgive loneliness. Slowly, with shaking legs, I stood up. The old warrior nodded once. He turned and walked back toward his horse without waiting for my answer. But I followed him. I didn't know where they were taking me. I didn't know if I would survive the journey. All I knew was that the boy who had lived on that ranch was gone forever, and the path ahead of me now led straight into the world of the Apache, the world that would one day become my home, and the world that would one day force me to face the ghosts of my past. The ride into the mountains lasted nearly an entire day. At least it felt that long to me. I had never ridden that far without stopping before. My legs ached, my throat burned with thirst, and the desert sun beat down on us without mercy. One of the Apache warriors had lifted me onto the back of his horse when they realized I was too weak to walk. Not one of them spoke much. They communicated mostly in their own language, short, quiet words that flowed like the wind across the desert. I understood none of it, and that made the fear inside me grow even stronger. Back home, settlers often told stories about the Apache. Most of those stories were filled with blood and anger. According to the tales I grew up hearing, Apache warriors were ruthless killers who attacked ranches without warning. But the men riding beside me didn't look like monsters. They looked calm, disciplined, focused. The old warrior who had spoken to me earlier rode in front of the group. The others seemed to follow his lead without question. Several times he looked back at me, as if making sure I was still alive. Late in the afternoon, we finally reached the mountains. The land changed there. The flat desert slowly rose into rocky hills dotted with twisted trees and hidden streams. The air felt cooler, and the wind carried the scent of pine instead of dust. Then I saw it, the Apache camp. It appeared suddenly as we rounded a narrow ridge. Dozens of teepees stood in a wide clearing, surrounded by tall rocks that formed a natural wall around the valley. Smoke rose from cooking fires, drifting slowly into the evening sky. Children ran between the tents. Women worked near the fires. Dogs barked as our horses approached. The moment we entered the camp, everything changed. People stopped what they were doing and stared at me. I could feel dozens of eyes watching. Curious eyes, suspicious eyes. Some even looked angry. After all, I was a stranger, and worse than that, I was white. The warrior who carried me helped me down from his horse. My legs nearly collapsed beneath me when they touched the ground. I must have looked pathetic standing there, dust-covered, exhausted, and half-starved. The old warrior dismounted and walked toward a large teepee near the center of the camp. Before entering, he spoke to a woman who stood nearby. She looked older than most of the others, with silver hair braided down her back and sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The old warrior gestured for me to follow him. Inside the teepee, the air was warm and smelled faintly of herbs and smoke. He sat down slowly across from me and motioned for me to sit as well. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally he said, "My name, Black Hawk." His voice was deep but calm. I swallowed before answering. "Daniel," I said. He nodded slowly. "Daniel." The way he said my name sounded strange but respectful. Then he asked the question I had been dreading. What happened? The memories rushed back instantly. The fire, the gunshots, my parents. My voice shook as I explained everything. The outlaws, the burning ranch, my father fighting, my mother screaming my name. By the time I finished speaking, my hands were trembling. Black Hawk listened without interrupting. When I was done, he remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke softly. "Bad men." I nodded, yes. He studied my face carefully. "You have family?" I shook my head. "No." The word felt heavier than I expected. For the first time since the attack, I truly comprehended that there was no one left. Understood how alone I was. Black Hawk leaned back slightly and stared toward the entrance of the teepee, thinking. Then he said something that shocked me. "You stay here." I blinked in confusion. "What?" "You stay with Apache." I didn't understand. "Why?" He looked at me like the answer was obvious. "You alone." Then he pointed toward the valley outside. "Apache protect their own." Those words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. Protect their own. That night they gave me food. It was simple, roasted meat, and a kind of flatbread, but to me it tasted better than anything I had ever eaten. I devoured it like a starving wolf. A few of the children sat nearby, watching me eat. They whispered to each other and laughed quietly. One brave little boy finally stepped closer. He pointed at my light brown hair. "Why color like sun?" he asked. The other children giggled. I shrugged awkwardly. "I guess that's just how I was born." He nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Then he ran back to the others. For the first time since the attack on my ranch, I almost smiled. But not everyone in the camp welcomed me. Later that night, as the fires burned low, a younger warrior approached Black Hawk. He spoke quickly in Apache, clearly angry about something. Even though I couldn't understand the words, I understood the tone. He didn't want me there. Black Hawk listened calmly. Then he responded with a few quiet words. The younger warrior looked frustrated, but finally nodded and walked away. I later learned his name was Running Wolf, and he would become both my greatest rival and eventually my closest friend. The days that followed were strange. I expected to be treated like a prisoner, but instead, The Apache treated me like a guest. Women brought me food. Children followed me around the camp. The warriors mostly ignored me, but they never threatened me. Still, I felt like an outsider. Everything about their world was different. They woke before sunrise and began working immediately. Some prepared hunting gear. Others gathered wood or repaired tools. Their lives were deeply connected to the land. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken for granted. After about a week, Black Hawk approached me again. "You stay with us," he said. I nodded. I had nowhere else to go. He handed me a small knife. Apache boy must learn to live. From that moment forward, my life began to change. I started learning their ways. How to track animals across rocky ground. How to move silently through the desert. How to read the wind and the sky. It wasn't easy. I failed often. Running Wolf laughed at me more than once when I stumbled through lessons that Apache children learned before they were 10. But slowly, I improved, and something surprising happened. The tribe began to accept me, not as a white boy, but as something new, something in between. Months passed. Then one evening, during a gathering around the central fire, Black Hawk stood before the tribe. He spoke for several minutes in Apache. Everyone listened carefully. When he finished, he turned toward me. "You have new name now," he said. My heart pounded. "New name?" He nodded. "Two worlds." The tribe repeated it softly. "Two worlds." In that moment I realized something powerful. I no longer belonged to the life I had lost, but I didn't fully belong here either. I stood between two worlds, and I would spend the rest of my life walking the line between them. The first winter I spent with the Apache nearly killed me. Not because the cold was unbearable, though the desert nights in the mountains could freeze a man to the bone, but because I was still learning what it meant to survive the way they did. Back at my father's ranch, survival meant hard work and stubbornness. But the Apache understood survival in a deeper way. They didn't try to conquer the land the way settlers did. They listened to it. They watched it. They moved with it. At first I struggled with everything. Tracking animals across rocky ground seemed impossible. The Apache hunters could look at a patch of dirt and read it like a book. They could tell what animal passed through, how long ago it had been there, and even whether it was wounded. To me, it just looked like dust. Running Wolf took great pleasure in pointing out my mistakes. "You walk like buffalo," he said once, as I clumsily stepped on a branch that snapped loudly beneath my boot. "I'm trying," I replied, slightly annoyed. He laughed and shook his head, trying loud. But even though he mocked me, Running Wolf never truly abandoned me. In fact, he trained me harder than anyone else. At dawn he dragged me out of my blankets and forced me to run across the rocky hills. My lungs burned every time, and my legs often felt like they would collapse beneath me. But slowly, my body changed. I grew stronger, faster. My hands hardened from climbing rocks and pulling bowstrings. Black Hawk watched all of this quietly. He rarely spoke during my training, but whenever I managed to do something right, even something small, he would nod once, and that nod meant everything. One day Running Wolf handed me a bow. "Today," he said, "you hunt." I stared at the weapon. Back on the ranch, I had used rifles, not bows. The curved wood and taut string looked simple enough, but the Apache handled it with a level of skill I had never seen before. Running Wolf pointed toward the hills. "Rabbit," he said. "That's it?" I asked. He smirked. "If you can catch one." I spent nearly 3 hours wandering the hills that day. 3 hours chasing shadows. Every rabbit I saw vanished before I could even draw the bow properly. Frustrated, I finally sat on a rock and sighed. Maybe I didn't belong here after all. Maybe I would always be the outsider. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "You think too loud." I turned and saw Black Hawk standing a few steps away. I hadn't even heard him approach. "How long were you there?" I asked. He smiled slightly. "Long enough." I looked down at the bow. "I'm not very good at this." He sat beside me. Animals listen too. I don't understand. He picked up a small stone and tossed it gently down the hill. Is hunter angry, hungry, loud? Animals feel it. He looked at me. You must become quiet here. He tapped his chest. I stayed silent for a moment, thinking about his words. Then I stood up again. This time I moved slower, calmer. Instead of chasing the rabbits, I waited. Nearly an hour passed before I finally saw one, nibbling at a patch of grass between two rocks. I held my breath, slowly drew the bow, released. The arrow flew straight. The rabbit collapsed instantly. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. When I returned to camp carrying the rabbit, Running Wolf looked genuinely surprised. You kill it? Yes. He inspected the animal carefully. Then he nodded once. Maybe you not buffalo after all. That night we roasted the rabbit over the fire. And for the first time since arriving at the Apache camp, I truly felt like I belonged. But peace rarely lasts long in the frontier. One afternoon several months later, the scouts returned from the valley with troubling news. White soldiers had entered Apache land. The frontier was always filled with tension between settlers, soldiers, and tribes. But this time it was different. These soldiers weren't just passing through, they were searching. Black Hawk gathered the warriors around the central fire. Running Wolf translated quietly for me. They look for someone, he said. Who? Running Wolf looked directly at me. A white boy. My stomach tightened. At first I thought it was impossible. No one could have survived the attack on my ranch. The outlaws had burned everything. No witnesses remained. But the scouts described something else. The soldiers had spoken to nearby settlements. They were asking questions about a boy who had disappeared months earlier. A boy named Daniel Hale. My name. The news spread through the camp quickly. Some of the warriors looked uneasy. Keeping a white boy among them might now bring trouble. That night, Running Wolf approached me near the edge of the camp. You hear soldiers, he said. Yes. You want to go with them? The question surprised me. I looked around the camp, the fires, the tents, the people who had slowly become my new family. No, I said firmly. He studied my face. Why? I thought about my parents, about the burned ranch, about the life I had lost. I don't belong with them anymore, I said quietly. Running Wolf nodded. You Apache now. His words filled me with both pride and uncertainty. But the soldiers weren't the only danger coming. A few days later, another scout returned with even worse news. Outlaws had been seen near the valley. Not just any outlaws. The same group that had attacked my ranch. My blood ran cold when I heard it. I remembered their faces, their voices, the fire. Black Hawk noticed the change in my expression. You know these men, he said. I nodded slowly. They killed my family. The camp fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Running Wolf stepped forward. We find them, he said. Black Hawk raised a hand. No. Everyone looked confused. He turned to me. If you chase it, it never ends. I understood his warning. But deep inside me, another feeling was growing. A burning need for justice. Or maybe revenge. I didn't know which. That night, as I lay beneath the stars outside my teepee, I stared at the dark mountains surrounding the valley. Somewhere beyond those mountains were the men who destroyed my life. The men who thought they had left no survivors. They were wrong. And sooner or later, they would discover that the boy they tried to erase had become something far more dangerous. A warrior raised by the Apache. The desert has a strange way of carrying danger, long before you can see it. Sometimes it arrives with distant dust clouds. Sometimes with the silence of frightened animals. And sometimes it arrives through the quiet warnings of men who know the land better than anyone else. That warning came from one of our scouts. He returned to camp just before sunset, his horse lathered with sweat, and his eyes sharp with urgency. Everyone in the camp immediately knew something was wrong. The Apache didn't panic when danger approached. Panic wastes energy. Instead, the entire camp shifted into a calm readiness that felt almost unnatural to me. Women quietly began packing supplies. Children were gathered together. Warriors moved toward the center of camp where Black Hawk stood waiting. I joined them, my heart already beating faster. The scouts spoke quickly in Apache. Even though I couldn't understand every word, I caught enough to feel the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. Running Wolf leaned close and whispered the translation. "Soldiers," he said. "How many?" "Maybe more." My stomach sank. 20 soldiers were enough to cause serious trouble, even for experienced warriors. But that wasn't the worst part. The scout continued speaking. Running Wolf's expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Outlaws ride with them." For a moment the world around me seemed to stop. Outlaws. My mind instantly returned to the night of the fire. The gunshots, the flames, the scream of my mother's voice as everything collapsed around us. I clenched my fists. "Are you sure?" I asked. Running Wolf nodded. "Scouts say he recognized one man." My heart pounded harder. "Who?" Running Wolf looked directly into my eyes, man with scar across face. The breath left my lungs. I knew exactly who that was. The leader, the man who had laughed while our cabin burned. The man who shot my mother. His name was Cole Mercer. For months I had tried to bury that memory deep inside me. Black Hawk often warned that revenge could poison a man's spirit. But hearing that name again ignited something dark inside my chest. The past had finally caught up to me. Black Hawk raised his hand, and the warriors fell silent. The scout finished speaking. Then Black Hawk slowly looked around the circle before his gaze settled on me. "They come for you," he said quietly. I swallowed hard. "Then I'll leave." The words came out before I had fully thought them through. "If I leave the camp," I continued, "they won't have any reason to attack the tribe." Running Wolf immediately shook his head. "No, this isn't your fight," I argued. Running Wolf stepped closer. "You Apache." I looked toward Black Hawk. The old leader's expression remained calm, but his eyes were thoughtful. "You think soldiers stop if you go?" he asked. I didn't answer, because deep down I knew the truth. They wouldn't. To them, the Apache camp itself was the problem. My presence only gave them an excuse. Black Hawk finally spoke again. "We move camp tonight." Several warriors nodded. Apache tribes rarely stayed in one place long when danger approached. Their survival depended on mobility and knowledge of the land. Within minutes the camp began quietly preparing to leave. But inside me, a storm was building. Running away again felt wrong. Those outlaws had already destroyed my first home. Now they were threatening the second one. That night, while everyone packed supplies and prepared the horses, I walked alone toward the edge of the valley. The stars above the desert were brighter than anywhere else in the world, but I barely noticed them. My thoughts were locked on one thing: Cole Mercer. The memory of his face haunted me, the scar across his cheek, the cruel smile he wore while watching my home burn. I felt footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Black Hawk. You carry heavy fire inside," he said. I nodded. "They killed my family." "Yes. I can't just run away." Black Hawk studied the mountains in silence for a moment. Then he spoke slowly. "Revenge feels like justice," he said, "but often it only feeds the fire." "What would you do?" I asked. He looked at me carefully. "I would protect my people." Those words hit me harder than anything else he could have said. Protect my people. The Apache were my people now, which meant the outlaws and soldiers coming toward this valley were threatening far more than just me. That night, we left the camp. The Apache moved like ghosts through the mountains. Fires were extinguished. By the time dawn arrived, the valley looked completely abandoned. We traveled deep into a canyon system, where steep cliffs and narrow passes made it difficult for outsiders to follow. But scouts soon returned with troubling news. The soldiers were still tracking us, and Cole Mercer was leading them. 3 days later, the inevitable finally happened. One of our scouts spotted the approaching riders from a high ridge. They were closer than anyone expected. Black Hawk gathered the warriors again. This time his voice carried a tone I had never heard before. "We fight." My heart pounded. Running Wolf handed me a bow and a rifle. "You ready?" he asked. I looked down at the weapons. Months ago I would have been terrified. Now I felt something else. Determination. "They took everything from me once," I said. Running Wolf nodded. "Not this time." We moved into position along the rocky ridges, overlooking a narrow pass. It was the only path the soldiers could use to enter the canyon. The Apache warriors blended into the rocks so perfectly that even I had trouble spotting them. Hours passed. Then finally, dust clouds appeared in the distance. The riders approached slowly. I counted them as they entered the pass. Soldiers in blue coats, and behind them, outlaws. My chest tightened when I saw him. Cole Mercer. The scar on his cheek was impossible to miss. He looked older than I remembered, but his cruel smile hadn't changed. As the riders moved deeper into the canyon, Black Hawk raised his hand. The signal. My fingers tightened around the rifle. For a moment I hesitated. Then I remembered the flames consuming our cabin. His voice. I remember the smell of smoke. The shot echoed through the canyon, and the battle began. The moment my rifle fired, the canyon exploded into chaos. The sound echoed violently between the towering rock walls, turning a single gunshot into what sounded like 100. My bullet struck one of the riders near the front of the column, knocking him from his horse before he even realized what was happening. For half a second, the soldiers and outlaws froze in confusion. Then, the Apache arrows began to fall. From every ridge surrounding the narrow canyon, warriors rose from the rocks like spirits of the land itself. Arrows streaked through the air, silent and deadly. Horses screamed and reared as riders tried to understand where the attack was coming from. Running Wolf fired beside me. His arrow struck a soldier in the shoulder, spinning the man sideways in the saddle. The soldiers quickly tried to form a line, shouting orders to one another, but the canyon made it nearly impossible for them to organize. They were trapped in a narrow space, with enemies above them on every side. The Apache had chosen the battlefield well, but my focus wasn't on the soldiers. My eyes searched through the chaos for only one man, Cole Mercer. I finally spotted him near the middle of the group. Even in the confusion, he seemed strangely calm. His scarred face twisted into that same cruel smile I remembered from the night my life burned away. He shouted something to the outlaws, and they immediately began pushing their horses toward the side of the canyon, trying to climb the rocky slope to reach our position. Running Wolf noticed. "They try to reach us," he shouted. Several Apache warriors moved to block their path. Arrows rained down, forcing the outlaws to retreat briefly. But Mercer wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. He fired his rifle toward the ridge, the bullet striking the rocks near my feet. Dust exploded into my face. For a moment, I realized something terrifying. He knew where I was. Maybe he recognized me. Maybe he just sensed that someone up here was targeting him. Either way, our battle had begun. I reloaded my rifle quickly and aimed again. But before I could fire, Mercer's horse suddenly bolted forward through the chaos. He rode straight toward a narrow section of the canyon wall, where the rocks created a steep path upward. Running Wolf saw it too. He climbing. My heart pounded. If Mercer reached the ridge, he could attack the warriors from behind. Without thinking, I grabbed my bow and began scrambling down the rocky slope to intercept him. "Two worlds," Running Wolf shouted behind me. "Wait!" But I couldn't wait. This fight had followed me across 2 lives. It had started the night my parents died, and now It had to end. The climb down the rocks was dangerous, but adrenaline pushed me forward. By the time I reached the lower part of the canyon wall, Mercer was already halfway up the slope with 2 of his men behind him. He spotted me immediately. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Recognition flashed across his scarred face. "Well now," he said with a low laugh, "look what crawled out of the ashes." The sound of his voice sent a cold wave through my body. "You remember me," I said. "How could I forget?" he replied. "Kid from that little ranch we burned." His grin widened. "Thought you died with the rest of them." Anger surged through my chest like fire. "You killed my family!" Mercer shrugged as if the memory meant nothing. "That's frontier life, boy." Then he raised his rifle. I dove sideways just as the shot cracked through the canyon. The bullet struck the rock behind me. I rolled across the ground and quickly drew an arrow, firing before he could reload. Mercer jerked backward as the arrow grazed his arm. He cursed and dropped the rifle. But he was fast. In one smooth motion he pulled a revolver from his belt. The gun aimed directly at my chest. For a split second, everything slowed. I could hear the distant battle raging behind us. I could see the hatred burning in Mercer's eyes, and I realized something important. If I killed him now, the revenge I had carried for so long would finally be complete. But would it bring peace? Blackhawk's words echoed in my mind. "Revenge feeds the fire." Mercer pulled the trigger. The gun clicked empty. He had already fired the last round. Surprise flashed across his face. Before he could react, Running Wolf suddenly appeared from the rocks above and tackled him to the ground. The revolver flew from Mercer's hand. The 2 men struggled violently in the dirt. I rushed forward and kicked the gun away. Mercer managed to shove Running Wolf aside and scrambled to his feet, pulling a knife from his belt. He lunged at me. I blocked his arm, but the force knocked both of us to the ground. The knife slashed past my shoulder, tearing through my shirt. We rolled across the dirt, each trying to gain control of the blade. Mercer was stronger than I expected. Years of outlaw life had made him tough, but Apache training had made me faster. I twisted his wrist sharply. The knife fell from his hand. For a moment, we both froze, breathing heavily. Then Mercer laughed again. "You think killing me changes anything?" he said. "It changes everything," I replied. I picked up the knife. He stared at it, waiting, maybe even expecting it. The memory of my mother's scream flashed through my mind again. This was the man responsible. One quick movement could end it all. But then I looked around. Running Wolf stood nearby. Apache warriors fought bravely along the canyon walls. These people had saved me, raised me, given me a second life. If I allowed revenge to consume me now, I would become exactly the kind of man Mercer was. I lowered the knife. Mercer looked confused. "You're not worth it," I said. Running Wolf stepped forward and bound Mercer's hands with leather straps. The battle in the canyon was already ending. Without their leader, the remaining outlaws quickly surrendered or fled. The soldiers, realizing they were trapped and outnumbered, eventually lowered their weapons as well. When the dust finally settled, the canyon grew quiet again. Black Hawk approached slowly. He looked at Mercer, then at me. "You choose your path," he said. I nodded. The past doesn't own me anymore. Mercer was later taken away by the soldiers, this time as their prisoner instead of their guide. Justice would come through the law. But my war with him was over. That night the Apache camp rested in a hidden valley beyond the canyon. Fires burned softly under the stars. Children laughed again. Women prepared food. Life continued. Running Wolf sat beside me near the fire. "You could kill him," he said. "Yes, but you didn't." I stared into the flames. "I already lost one life to him," I said quietly. "I won't lose another." Running Wolf smiled slightly. "Then you truly Apache." Later that night, Black Hawk joined us. He looked toward the sky for a long time before speaking. "You walk between 2 worlds," he said. I nodded. "I know." But tonight, he continued, you proved something important. What's that? He looked directly at me. You choose which world lives inside you. The fire crackled softly between us. For the first time, since the night my childhood burned away, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because my past had disappeared, but because I had learned how to live beyond it. And as the stars stretched across the endless desert sky, I realized something else. The boy who lost his family in the fire was gone. But the man who rose from those ashes belonged to two worlds.